In this episode, I'm joined by Natan Obed. He's the president of Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami. Natan is originally from Nunatsiavut, and he's one of the most influential voices in Canada for Inuit rights and self-determination. You'll find him a lot of the time in Ottawa, where he brings a pragmatic and determined style of advocacy to the halls of power. We talk about urgent infrastructure needs in Inuit Nunat, from deep water ports to broadband connectivity, and how investments in projects like the Grays Bay Port could unlock long-term economic opportunity. Natan has a vision for a more equitable Canada where Inuit communities are full partners in Canada's growth. Here's our conversation. Natan Obed, thank you for joining us.
I'm happy to be here.
You're from Nunatsiavut originally,
Yes.
from Nain specifically.
Yes.
And listeners might not realize that you moved to the United States as a teenager and went to Tufts University in Boston, taking American Studies, which I found very interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about the journey that took you back to Canada and to the job that you have right now as president of the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami?
Sure. Well, I think some of that intro needs some additional explanation.
Yes, go ahead.
I double majored at Tufts in English with a creative writing focus. And my American Studies degree was really an Indigenous Studies degree.
Aha.
I did a lot of prerequisites for the American Studies, so learning about like beat poetry or, the evolution of certain movements in the 20th century. My main focus was on Nunatsiavut Inuit, and at that time we were still negotiating our modern treaty, and elements around that modern treaty. Ultimately, I did a senior honors thesis on the potential impacts of the signing of the modern treaty between Nunatsiavut Inuit and the Crown, and juxtapose what had happened in places like Alaska, in the Inuvialuit region in the Northwest Territories, or the Nunavut Agreement as comparables to what may happen in Nunatsiavut. So yes, on the cover, it was an American Studies degree, but it was way more Canada than it was America of what I was able to do. And it really was during that time that I became interested in Inuit self-determination. I grew up between two cultures. My mother is an American. She is from Maine, and my father is an Inuk, and he was from Hebron, Newtok area, relocated to Hopedale, spent the majority of his childhood in residential school, but then went back to Nain after being away for a long time. My parents were from very different worlds. My mother is a teacher. She's also a children's author. And so when I was in the States, I was obviously not white. And I was always asked, like, well, where are you from? And it wasn't like, are you from a town 30 minutes from here? It's just like, what ethnicity are you? Mm-hmm. And I would then be able to talk about being from the Canadian Arctic and being Inuk. But when I was in Nunatsiavut, often growing up, I was linked with the United States. And a lot of my peers hadn't traveled to the U.S. We only knew the U.S. through cable TV. And at that time, a lot of our cable channels were from Detroit and Michigan, which were very crime-ridden areas at that time. So people had an idea of the U.S. as this Wild West style place, very dangerous place. So I really had to think about who I was, because in each one of those scenarios growing up, I was not necessarily completely from that one place. And I've always cared for and loved all of my family and wherever I'm from, but I've really identified as being Inuk, and I identify with Inuit society and culture, and just the way in which that has grounded me in life. And so after university, I wanted to do all I could to help with the Inuit rights movement. and helping implement land claim agreements, helping however I could with the studies that I was able and the degree that I was able to have. I know that there are not many other Inuit who are able to take that educational journey that I had, or were in a place where they could provide that support at the national level or at the regional level. So I always just thought that it was an incredible opportunity that I had, and then gave me an incredible opportunity to continue to help in a field that I'm really passionate about.
You must, being the child of an Inuk parent and an American parent must give you a really interesting lens on what's happening right now with the threat to our sovereignty, and which comes seemingly every week now from Donald Trump. But how is that rising up for you?
Well, there's a few things that I think of immediately. The first is, as a child in Labrador, growing up in a post-World War II, post-Cold War era militarized zone, basically. There are over 60 military bases across Inuit Nunatsiavut. Bases perhaps is the wrong word, installations that were built for different reasons, whether they were for radar or for strategic resupply or logistics across Inuit Nunatsiavut. So we grew up having militarization happening to us. And in the 70s and 80s, when I was growing up, I remember growing up in Northwest River, and one of the things that we would do is in the forests or the woods around our place, we would find all these old U.S. military things, like whether they be for the different exercises that we're doing in the area or just things that had been discarded. And so it was normal for us that there was this militarization. Now, when we're talking about investing in the North and investing in the Arctic, and the Canadian government, whether it be provincial premiers or the Prime Minister or anyone saying what should happen in the Arctic, I don't think that anyone has that appreciation that we grew up with militarization from, especially in the 1940s and 1950s, that has impacted our communities in an almost absolute way. Kuujjuaq, Qattawit, Cambridge Bay, Inuvik, Resolute Bay, Hall Beach, Coral Harbor. These are all communities whose essential infrastructure was built by the Americans in the Cold War. These also became hubs or places of strategic importance in Canada's interest to coerce Inuit off the land, especially in Nunavut in the 1950s and 60s. So we know all too well about militarization, what happens to our society in the face of global threats. So it means even more to us now to be partners in any sort of Canadian response to external threats or to increased strategic military defense and sovereignty exercises in Inuit Nunatsiavut, because of what we've already lived through and the way in which we were not consulted or allowed to participate in a lot of what happened in the 50s and 60s. Additionally, Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic is exclusively due to Inuit land use and occupancy. And we are fortunate to live in a country where Section 35 of the Constitution upholds our rights. We are named explicitly in the Constitution along with First Nations and Métis. We also have modern treaties that encompass 40% of Canada's landmass, 72% of its coastline. So we've done our homework. We've created a relationship, or in the UN terms, a constructive arrangement with Canada as a nation state to ensure that our self-determination and our rights are upheld in perpetuity. We also have created, through our modern treaties, co-management structures so that for environmental assessment or for land or for water or for other major decisions that jurisdictions have control over, that Inuit participate in those processes. So we are very mindful of keeping those intact and having the rest of the country understand the homework that we've done that will allow for us to assert Canadian sovereignty as a nation state, in part due to the constructive arrangements that Canada has with Inuit. I don't think that Canadians appreciate that when they think about sovereignty just as a Canadian principle. And I would really like to insert that as part of the conversation moving forward.
Just for our listeners, you've referred a few times to Inuit Nunat, which is a term that covers all of Inuit territory, and there are 4 parts of Inuit territory.
Yeah.
There is the part that you're from, so Nunatsiavut, Nunavik, which is for all intents and purposes northern Quebec, Nunavut, and Inuvialuit. Right?
Yes, correct.
And just to emphasize what size of land that we're talking about, 40% of Canada, our territory, and 72% of our coastline.
Yeah.
So this is a big piece of Canadian territory that I think many Canadians don't think about very often or take for granted. And I've heard you speak about this before, and you just said it now, that Inuit people have done their part in terms of coming to the table for treaty negotiations and being present and also asserting sovereignty in the north. And that Canada hasn't been there, or Canada has, the idea of Canada, the promise of Canada hasn't extended to the north. Can you talk a little bit about that and where the failure has been?
Yeah. Well, first, in relation to the term, I think it's important that people know that it's a geopolitical term. It's one that we have thoughtfully created. Mary Simon was the president of ITK when that term was endorsed by the board of directors. And we bring that into the world now as a defined term. And the Canadian government is slowly taking that term up. The former Prime Minister Trudeau would use that term to its proper definition whenever he spoke about the relationship between Canada and Inuit under his prime ministerialship. And that was a huge benefit to us from a policy perspective and from a legislative perspective. We are a people that have huge socioeconomic disparity with the rest of the country. And when you think about social programming in the federal context, and from a policy context generally, Canada is a nation state that prides itself on equity, on ensuring equity across populations, no matter what the barrier to equity might be in a particular province or territory. Even equalization payments are a form of that equity across the country so that provinces and territories can provide an equitable amount of services for education, for healthcare, for justice, so that certain Canadians are not left in worse conditions than others based on geography or on jurisdictional status. That hasn't applied for an ethnic status for Inuit in this country. We have 52% overcrowding for housing. We have a TB rate that's over 300 times the national average. We have a suicide rate, especially among young people between 16 and 30, that is 12 times the national average. We have upwards to 70% food insecurity in our population. So, and I could name off a number of other socioeconomic statistics that relay the same point. It's that there is socioeconomic inequity from Inuit to the rest of Canada, and it's structural. In many cases, our jurisdictions were formed later. We're more remote. There are only 2 communities that have access to Canada through an all-weather road, that being Inuvik and Tuktoyaktuk in the Northwest Territories. So we rely almost exclusively on air travel for resupply in the winter for any perishable items. And then once or twice a year, we get marine resupply, mostly out of the port of Montreal for Nunavut and Nunavik and parts of the Northwest Territories, and more locally in Nunatsiavut. That said, though, we have a fundamental lack of infrastructure. And then we also have a fundamental lack of health infrastructure or educational infrastructure. And it doesn't seem to matter whether or not we are in a province like Quebec or a territory like Nunavut. Our socioeconomic status is roughly similar across Inuit Nunat. So what we've been asking for is equity, but we also have been imagining that Canada can finish its nation building by investing more in the infrastructure of Inuit Nunat to allow for prosperity for Inuit, the way that Canadian prosperity is within reach for most other Canadians.
And yet, Inuit people are so patriotic or feel Canadian first before feeling that they're Inuit. I think I've heard you say this before. Why would that be? I'm curious because I feel my assumption would be that with all the weaknesses that you've described and a sort of forgetting about equity issues in the North, that people might be resentful or not feel that sense of Canadianness.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And Josie Kustigak, who coined the term First Canadians, Canadians First, it's a sentiment that is widely held among Inuit society, that we are patriotic Canadians and we are patriotic Inuit as well. We're so proud to be Inuit. It's hard to justify our faith in Canada and the ongoing hope that we have that the next prime minister, the next government is going to truly bring Inuit Nunatsiavut into Canada, or is truly going to care about social equity between Inuit and non-Inuit. But we're very pragmatic as well, and it's almost to us, we don't see another path to success, and we take the Canadian government's word, or even provinces and territories' word about their intent, and just expect that that intent is fulfilled. What reason does Canada have to lie to us about their intent, about our population? And we still hold out that Canada isn't being devious or deceptive about its true intentions about Indigenous peoples or about Inuit, even in the face of that not being the case. So this just has been our political I'm stumbling over the right word to use, but it's just the way in which we've decided to engage with the government of Canada. And we've decided to act in good faith. We've decided to be practical and pragmatic. We've many times when I talk to federal ministers or the Prime Minister, I say, I've come 95% of the way to you. I've had to understand Canada's constitution, its legal status, its legislation, the way that it's created its ministries, the powers that each ministry has, the difference between the public service and the political staffers within your office, the considerations that you have as a minister about your electability, what you're thinking about from a party platform perspective, from an East-West, Pacific, Atlantic, Western alienation perspective. And I come to you with something that fits within all of that matrix for your consideration. Often ministers then aren't even aware of their own legislation or their own policies within their departments around Inuit specific issues. And along the way, I have to educate them as well about who Inuit are, about where we fit within a legislative or constitution or policy context, and then be very kind about the ignorance that exists. And it's just the way in which we've decided to do our politics. You could describe it as being completely unfair, but from our perspective, it's the only way that we will get ahead in any way, shape, or form. We have less than 70,000 people. I drove from my house, which is, I'm in Gatineau at the moment, and drove to the airport, and I go through 4 ridings. There are 3 ridings across Inuit Nunat, Northwest Territories. There are 4: Northwest Territories, Nunavut, Northern Quebec, and Labrador. So that's like the political influence. I can fly for 5 hours on a jet and I go through 4 ridings, or I drive 22 minutes from my house to the airport here in the South and I go through 4 ridings. So that just gives you a sense of what we're up against when it comes to the political decision making in the country as well.
That's a lot of perseverance and patience that you're bringing to the table. So now the North is suddenly in every conversation, policy conversation, as Canada talks about how to pivot from a trade relationship, for example, that was always facing south of the United States, how we're going to build resilience in the country, find new export markets, find new products to export. The word critical minerals must come up in every conversation that I'm in. And I wonder, when you hear these conversations, the North, the North, the North, what goes through your mind?
Well, even our modern treaties are all set up in a resource extraction focused way. One of the only reasons why the Labrador Inuit Land Claim Agreement was signed was because of the discovery of nickel and cobalt at Voisey's Bay. And it finally made it appeasable for the Newfoundland government to come to the table and negotiate the agreement with the government of Canada and Inuit. So we've known for decades that at the heart of our own modern treaty process and the place where we sit within Canada is a larger consideration about resource extraction and jurisdictional wealth. At this time, when we start to hear more and more about energy corridors or north-south corridors, we also have advocated as Inuit for projects that will encourage or spur on natural resource extraction or major projects across Inuit Nunatsiavut, or create travel routes or trade routes that allow for greater prosperity. We understand that that is something that our society would like as well, but only within the framework of our constructive arrangements with the country. So we're not saying that at all costs we want to pursue economic development or these new national interests. We're saying that we want these interests to exist within the existing framework of our modern treaties and the ways in which we imagine success in our homeland for our populations. Like it or not, if we want to pursue self-government and self-determination, we are going to have to develop the resources that we have within our homeland. We also, because of the nature of our modern treaties and the small percentage of resources that we generate from any one natural resource extraction project in relation to the tax generation from Government of Canada or a jurisdictional perspective or a private mining perspective, we know that we will just have to be a part of this game as in perpetuity, that there will never be one resource extraction project that allows for us to run healthcare, education, our police force, build our infrastructure in our communities, and for us to run our self-governments. That's just not the way our treaties are structured. So I give that to the audience just to say that when you imagine why Inuit are coming to the table the way that we are, a lot of it is still out of necessity. And also because our wealth generation, the way that we fund our self-determination, is tied in hand with Canada. You've seen different agreements like the devolution agreement in Nunavut that allow for Inuit to take more of a leadership stance in the administration of lands or the consideration for wealth generation for jurisdictions, not just for rights holding Inuit, but for the jurisdiction of Nunavut. And so over time, I think we'll see a maturing of what it means to benefit from resource extraction. But I can't help but think that people still need an education about the terms and the rules of the game here. This isn't just the Wild West. We're not just opening up for anyone because there's a national interest. We have set those rules with the Government of Canada, and we expect for them to be followed. And the Inuit will be good partners in that process with that caveat. In the country, there's been a lot of fear of free, prior, informed consent. And on the conservative side, they've really driven this fear into a part of the Canadian public that if First Nations, quote unquote, had free, prior, and informed consent, then everything would shut down and Canada would not be able to function properly from an economic perspective. From our perspective, we have modern treaties and we have co-management processes or institutes of public governance processes that allow for any of our projects to go ahead, and the equivalent of FPIC being our modern treaties and the implementation of them and impact benefit agreements. So we already have the thing that people are so worried about. And there are projects that go ahead every year in Inuit Nunat, and the certainty that it's created has allowed for prosperity for not only people within the jurisdiction, but mining companies and the government.
And if anything, Canada is a bit behind other Arctic countries in terms of development and building infrastructure. What have you seen from other parts of the world that have maybe done a better job at that kind of development?
Well, we still run on diesel generation in all of our communities. If you look in Greenland, there are a number of communities that are on hydropower, are on clean energy. From an educational perspective, we are one of the only Arctic countries that doesn't have a university in the Arctic. The Yukon just transitioned from a Yukon college to Yukon University, but we still don't have a university in Inuit Nunat. If you look at Alaska and you look at Greenland again, they have universities that really drive, I guess, society forward, but then also from governance to the economy to critical thinking. Having a university in the Arctic, in an Arctic jurisdiction is incredibly positive. We are hoping to create an Inuit Nunat University by 2030. We're still fundraising for that and putting all the pieces in place, but that is another key indicator. And then just the very water, sewer,
Broadband.
airstrips, broadband, marine infrastructure. Like imagine, okay, you're in Nova Scotia and you live on an island and you don't have a deep water port. Like that's the reality for a lot of Inuit communities. There are 51 Inuit communities. Only 2 of them are not in a marine environment, but those 2 are in freshwater environments that lead to marine environments. So we're a marine people. All of our communities are based in marine, and there are only a few deep water ports, perhaps 3 or 4, depending upon definition of deep water port. So we just don't have the essential infrastructure in our communities that virtually any other community of any size has in Canada. And those things weaken our claims to sovereignty in many ways, but they are the biggest barriers to us having economic success. If we can't offload our catch from fishing adjacent to Canadian waters, and we have to offload that in Nuke, or that we have to buy ships that have freezer trawlers that don't offload at all and go straight to market because there's no infrastructure in the Canadian Arctic to do that work, then not only does that lose jobs within Inuit Nunat, but it also means that there's no supply, there's no network for supply getting any of that product into any store shelves across our homeland. So when dealing with broad food insecurity and a real interest in Arctic food, whether it be traditional or otherwise, we can't get any of that to market. So it's just these essential problems that I think other Canadians just would find completely unacceptable.
So we're at this juncture might mean that there's finally some change, or that we make headway on some major projects. If you had to name some priority projects, what would they be?
Well, I'll start with the ones that the Prime Minister has spoken about quite a bit already. The Grays Bay port in western Nunavut, which would create a deep water port, would also create a road that might service a number of different resource extraction projects or other ways to get materials in and out of Inuit Nunat. That would be a road coming up through Alberta and into western Nunavut. I would characterize that as a nation-building project. It would certainly help service Inuit communities, but it's more for what it does to the jurisdiction, or what it does to adjacent jurisdictions as well along that road, that opens up possibilities for resource extraction or other development and access to the Northwest Passage in a way that Canada just doesn't have at the moment. The Kivalliq hydrofiber link is another. It's a Nunavut-based project in central Nunavut. There was just an agreement between Premier Canoe and Premier Akayagok about the development of the hydro component of that just a couple of weeks ago. But again, that's a project that would service central Nunavut communities and would allow for broadband access and for hydropower to flow from Manitoba up into Nunavut. There are a lot of conversations about military projects and Canada spending to 2% of GDP, I believe it is.
Mm-hmm. For now,
for now,
the
yes.
demand might be much higher than that, but yes.
And what that might mean for the Arctic. In the Defense Policy Update from 2024, there was a lot of consideration for the Arctic, but not a lot of money for near-term projects. There was also this term mixed-use infrastructure that everyone loves saying, but nobody can define. And when defined in the past, it's been very restrictive. So wouldn't imagine that mixed-use infrastructure means we can just build water and sewer within a community that has a military component and call that mixed use. Mixed use in a traditional sense is something, maybe there's a small, side door that with a little stock room that maybe the community can use when you have 99% of the facility that is classified as a military with restricted access. I remain hopeful, but not expectant that Canada will be able to make good on its pledge for mixed-use infrastructure unless it redefines mixed-use infrastructure and uses whatever powers that it can. It actually uses political capital to stand up to anyone else who might criticize Canada, to say, what we are doing is mixed-use infrastructure, we've defined it, and we are going to stand beside Inuit communities and work with them. Again, dew line sites, distant early warning sites, are scattered all across the Canadian Arctic. They traditionally are off limits to Inuit, even though in some certain scenarios where there's been crises or maybe even goodwill between Inuit communities and those people who are working on the dew line sites, there can be access that's granted. But there's military installations all across our homeland already that really don't service our communities at all. So we have a hard time imagining that this magic term of mixed-use infrastructure is going to completely change the way that we can access and utilize military installations across the Arctic, or that the military would be considerate of Inuit communities in the way that it operates. It requires a sea change in thinking, and it requires leadership from the very top, from the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, to spend their time and energy on it, not just imagine that it'll happen because they're talking to an Inuit leader who would like to see it.
It requires a strategy, which we talk a lot about at the Institute with regard to industrial policy, that you need a kind of overarching strategy that has different nodes and connects to each other. But I can see how, the point that you're making is that part of that pre-thinking before you make investments would involve people from Inuit Nunat as part of the planning behind those projects. Which brings me to something else I wanted to talk to you about, which is Inuit Nunat policy, which you've been working on with the federal government. We're also very interested in the idea of state capacity and how well the federal public service is composed, or that the ability that it has to face modern challenges and geopolitical environment and so on, but also in the context of whether it's able to meet its obligations to its treaty partners in a way that makes sense. Can you talk a little bit about what you've observed in terms of the federal government's ability to take into account Inuit Nunat's interests?
For sure. I would say that this started in a philosophy that we had in 2015 when the Trudeau Liberals came to power and the Prime Minister asked Indigenous leaders, what is this relationship? Like, can you define it? How are we going to work together? And for Inuit, we spent a few months thinking about how best to work with this federal government, and we proposed the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee and the partnership table. Ultimately, it took almost a year for us to negotiate and implement the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee that was struck through the Inuit Crown Declaration that was signed in Iqaluit. The central premise is this, that there will always be the federal priorities. The federal government will always have a throne speech, it will always have mandate letters, it will always have party platforms. And for us, we will always have priorities as well. So why don't we get Inuit leadership together and the Crown, the government together at the political level and decide what are shared priorities, and to work on those priority areas through work plans and hold ourselves accountable to the work year over year, so as to make meaningful change for the country and for Inuit. We wanted to disrupt the political nature of being the benevolent dictator within the Indigenous context, meaning the government of Canada at some point will decide that an Indigenous community is worthy of their consideration and their funds. And a minister will descend upon that community and give a one-time allocation in the area that fits well with the government of Canada's priority areas or whatever issues they feel are most important of the day. And then the Indigenous community is grateful for that one-time expenditure, and they get the hyperbole of being a wonderful benefactor for Indigenous peoples. We said, we don't want you to come with your announcements. This table isn't about one-time success that is packaged in one news cycle that is not tied to any larger public policy or any shared ambition over a long period of time. So let's work out what we're going to do. Let's have the federal budget cycle be the place where we realize the shared priority areas into the shared work. And let's figure out how to structurally change the Government of Canada's relationship with Inuit. So within the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee, we had a scope of work to create the Inuit Nunat policy. It took us almost 3 years to develop the policy, co-develop the policy with the Government of Canada, and the Prime Minister announced that policy in April of 2022, I believe. It received further cabinet directive, a further cabinet directive in December 2024. Basically, we have always, as Inuit, been misunderstood from a federal bureaucratic perspective. We don't fall under the Indian Act. We don't have historic treaties. We are fundamentally different from a policy and a legislative and a Supreme Court and a constitutional perspective than First Nations or Métis. But we're so small that often we get lost in public policy making. Also, prior to 2015, the Government of Canada's Indigenous policy was basically Indian Act policy. Mm-hmm. It didn't really consider much else other than that because it had federal responsibilities there.
It wasn't distinctions based. I mean, no. Looking at different types of Indigenous people.
Yeah, ITK really was the leader to push for distinctions-based policy based on the lead up to the Kelowna negotiations and the Kelowna Accord, and that was the first time that we'd really tried to take Indigenous policy from a melting pot to a distinctions-based approach. So to come back to the Inuit Nunat policy, it allows for us to just get to work and not have to follow every single announcement that the Government of Canada makes, either through its own processes, through budgets, or through any initiatives that a minister might have. For us to track down who might be in charge of that initiative, to educate them about Inuit, to educate them about the differences between Inuit, First Nations, and Métis, and to ensure that there is an Inuit consideration within the creation of a piece of legislation, a policy or a program that is intended to support Indigenous people in some way. So we wanted to short circuit that task that only we had been doing over the past 50 years, so that it was shared by all public servants who could pick up a Government of Canada policy and read exactly how to follow it. And just like any other policy that they might follow within their day-to-day business, they would systematically be implementing our treaties, upholding our place within a distinctions-based framework between First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, and ultimately getting to better policy outcomes. We can't imagine the savings over time that this will cost for Canada, but also the savings of time and energy for Inuit institutions who otherwise would have to be finding that junior policy analyst who was writing that briefing note that informed the way a government department was going to implement a certain Treasury Board decision.
So if I'm hearing you right, there might be a funding announcement or a policy announcement, and no one was consulted before the announcement. Like, here's some money for X thing, but no one was told in advance or asked how it would affect the community, the relevant community, or how it played into a bigger kind of objective?
Yes, to expand on that, the the way in which a lot of these opportunities flow. Say there's an announcement on childcare, and it's an announcement for Canadians. There's considerations for Inuit within that. There are also considerations for First Nations or Métis. But if a government department that isn't Crown Indigenous Relations or Indigenous Services, who doesn't have a ton of expertise in Indigenous policy, is asked to do that task of implementing it for an Inuit or for an Indigenous component of a particular program, who knows what they might come up with. They might come up with something that has no consideration for Inuit whatsoever, or they might come up with something that is informed by the one Inuk that maybe they talked to 3 years ago.
Who might be from one part of Nunat, right? Okay.
And this has been deemed acceptable practice by the government of Canada for as long as Inuit have had a consideration that we are people. And it wasn't that long ago that we couldn't vote. It was 1959, I believe, when Inuit got the right to vote. So in the Canadian perspective, we're about 100 years late to the public policy consideration as people. And then once we got into the conversation, it was the dominant conversation has always been First Nations on reserve, because that's the federal legislation that impacts departments the most. So we're just trying to carve out this previously empty space. And this is, I think, the positive part about this is that if you think of a policy space, sometimes our work, whatever it might be, is to interrupt a particular policy direction and reroute it to one that's better. A lot of what we've been doing over the last 10 years is creating something that is within the policy itself already. The legislative, the constitutional, the Supreme Court, all of the metrics needed to do the work are already there. How to do it has been left undefined. And so we are putting definitions and specific considerations on how to do the work well that don't interrupt bad practice within the space. They just interrupt broad-based ignorance. And that's actually in a much better place to be, because you aren't necessarily angering or upsetting people who've been doing something for a certain way for their entire bureaucratic lives. We can bring more people into the space by saying, we've developed something that is innovative and positive, that adds to your effectiveness, that doesn't demand that you forsake one community over another when it comes to the work that you do. It's just to do it better.
Natan, you have a very profound government relations job. Probably more complex than any private sector company or anybody in this space. Just to wrap up, because this podcast is about our future ambitions and opportunities and so on, what do you think that Canada could accomplish if it truly worked in partnership with the people of Inuit Nunat?
Canada often thinks of itself as exceptional. We go out into the world, and I've observed many Canadian politicians and many Canadian citizens being very proud of being Canadian, and especially on the idea of equity or of human rights or of a just society. We can always do better. And I think this is one of these areas where Canada, just by being more deliberate and being more respectful can become the nation that it wants to be and already in many cases espouses itself to be. There was quite a few years there where Prime Minister Trudeau was very global focused, and especially on the reconciliation agenda, wanted to push the reconciliation agenda as an example to the rest of the world. That may have been a little bit ambitious for the moment that we were actually in, because there's still a lot of homework to do here at home, even though there are some really positive signs. So we've done a bunch of our homework, but now it's time to actually go out into the real world. Like, we're not students anymore in many cases, and like do our jobs. So if Canadian society and the Canadian government accept that Indigenous peoples have rights, and if Canadians also accept that the modern treaties, historic treaties, and the general relationship with Indigenous peoples is one of deliberate acceptance and respect, then we can get into the exciting work of what does Canada look like. Canada is not just municipal governments, provincial, territorial governments, and the federal government. Indigenous self-determination is an essential construction of this country. Canadians and the Canadian government have all showed through the Constitution, through modern treaties, through any number of mechanisms, that we accept that as a core principle of this country. At the very same time of not accepting the consequences of that admission. If we as Canadians got beyond this endless debate about how much we actually care about Indigenous people's rights and the implementation of those rights, and we just got to the business of doing it, I think we could achieve something that almost no other jurisdiction on earth has achieved when it comes to the way in which a nation state folds Indigenous rights and Indigenous right to self-determination into the very functional ways in which a nation state operates domestically, but also internationally. Imagine if we're at a UN climate conference and I took the floor for Canada and I talked about a Canadian position, and we had negotiated that position with Environment Canada, with Global Affairs, and that the Canadian government minister was excited that we are in such solidarity that I could take the floor for a nation state as an Indigenous rights holding leader. That would be an evolution in the way Canada thinks of itself that would be in line, I think, with what most Canadians would like to see. We often rest on laurels that are only partially realized. We have more homework to do, but we also have the implementation of that to do. And I'm here to say it's possible. And for Inuit leadership, I've stressed our pragmatism, our eternal optimism in the Canadian state against some very damning evidence. But moving forward, the potential that this country can reach, often its limitation is its ongoing racism and lack of acceptance of the role that Indigenous peoples play in the construction of this country.
Natan, thank you for joining us. It's a great way to end this talk. I appreciate you spending time with us.
Yeah, well, I'm so pleased to be able to give more of my insight rather than just a 2-minute interview on some of the things that just keep me up at night, but also the things that I've worked on for a decade. So I'm happy to share a larger insight with you and with the audience.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning in to Future Proofing Canada. Our executive producer is Cléa Desjardins. Our producer is Ricardo Montrose, and our production assistants are Elissa Coury and Blair Elliott. The show is mixed and engineered by Jackie Gallant, who also does our music. If you like what you heard and you'd like to find out more about our work at the IRPP, you can head over to irpp.org. You can subscribe to our newsletters and check out all our latest publications. And if you really, really like what you heard, leave us a review on your podcast app or share your feedback on social media. You can find us on most platforms at IRPP. For the Institute for Research on Public Policy, I'm Jennifer Ditchburn. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new episode of Future Proofing Canada.